Welcome to Access Asia. I'm Yuka Royer, and this week, as Donald Trump met with Narendra Modi, we're going to look at the relationship between the world's largest economy and the world's most populous nation, both run by nationalist leaders. And we welcome Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of The Hindu, to help us take a deep dive. Smiles, hugs and handshakes, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi received a warm welcome at the White House by his host Donald Trump. The two men bonded over their shared aspiration to make their countries great again and agreed to deepen security cooperation. But trade and tariffs figured extensively in the meeting, with Trump pointing to India's trade barriers as being very unfair and warning New Delhi would not be spared in his plan to impose reciprocal tariffs on all countries. Antonia Kerrigan has more.
As Donald Trump welcomed Narendra Modi to the White House, they greeted each other like old friends. But he had a bone to pick with Modi. On average, Indian goods are taxed at 3% entering the US, whereas US goods are slapped with a 9.5% import duty in India. The president almost admires India's protectionism, but made it clear it would have to change.
India's been, to us, just about the highest tariffed nation anywhere in the world. They've been very strong on tariffs, and I don't blame them necessarily, but it's a different way of doing business. As a signal of good faith, Prime Minister Modi recently announced the reductions to India's unfair, very strong tariff.
Trump also pointed to the US's nearly $50 billion trade deficit with India, America importing Indian pharmaceuticals, electronics and jewellery. India is in line for a shock as the Trump administration rolls out its new reciprocal tariffs policy in the coming weeks, but the two men were anxious to avoid a dispute, announcing an agreement to boost military sales to India starting this year, and a deal for US companies to build various nuclear plants in India as a way to rectify the trade deficit.
Friends, today we've set the target of more than doubling our bilateral trade by 2030 to reach $500 billion.
In some ways, India needs this relationship more than the US does. In 2024, the US was India's #1 trading partner, while India ranked 10th for the United States. But Washington needs partners in the region if they are to help counter China's economic dominance, as the Trump administration hopes to do.
For more on the India-US ties, let's bring in Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of the Indian national daily The Hindu. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, first of all, just how concerned is New Delhi about Mr. Trump's plan to impose across-the-board tariffs, reciprocal tariffs?
Well, so far, India has taken all of this on the chins. And the announcement on the reciprocal taxes came just a couple of hours before these two men that you're seeing on your screens actually met. So it wouldn't make sense for the government right now to react adversely to this kind of an announcement. Certainly, India does not like the tag of being a serious violator on tariffs. And certainly the government had, in preparation of this visit by Prime Minister Modi, already announced it was going to cut certain tariffs. It had already cut certain tariffs on things like motorcycles, and that it was looking for some kind of a negotiation with the US. So they are hopeful that these talks have kind of smoothed the path. The reciprocal tariffs will hurt, but at the end of the day, India is a developing economy. It certainly needs to be able to protect some of its industries, particularly on things like agriculture. So the government is waiting and watching to see how far this will go. The two bits of hope really for them is this idea that they will have some kind of what is called a compact, kind of balance sheet that will be put together talking about what each country does for the other. And the other is the plan for a phase 1 of a bilateral trade agreement to be signed sometime this year. And they're hoping that will at least smooth the path so that the US will not continue the rhetoric that it does of India being amongst the worst offenders on this.
Now, at the meeting, the two leaders also agreed for the US to increase military sales to India. But the defense sector is a priority for Mr. Modi in his Buy and Make in India strategy, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly a desired priority. I think the government would like to see much more made in India. But so far, they have not really been able to bring up the numbers of the percentage of products actually being made in India compared to what India actually needs. Now, when it comes to those defense equipments, the real problem is twofold. One, the US's desire not to share technology and not to share its highest end of equipment until it has more strategic partnership with India. India is not an alliance partner, for example. It's not an ally of the US's. And the second is India's already traditional dependence on Russian hardware and other hardware. And that inability to work with some of these larger defense systems when the preponderance of the hardware is coming from Russia. So until those change, it becomes difficult to make the pie that much larger. But we heard Mr. Trump even talking about selling India F-35 fighter jets. My colleagues there in Washington did ask the foreign secretary about what he thought of Mr. Trump's offer, and his response was, this is not a formal proposal right now. So I think it's some way away yet, but there's no question of what the U.S. would like for India to do, and that is to just buy much more from them.
Well, Suhasini, thank you. But stay with us if you can, because we're going to talk about another aspect of the bilateral relationship. Now, the two leaders also discussed immigration, with Narendra Modi saying India would take back any of its citizens living illegally in the United States. Mr. Modi recently accepted the return of 104 migrants deported from the United States on a military cargo plane, as opposed to a chartered commercial flight. The conditions they were brought in caused outcry in India. Peter O'Brien has more.
Harvinder is with his family in Punjab. He was one of the 104 deported on a US military aircraft back to India earlier this month.
It took us 40 hours to reach Amritsar airport. We were unshackled after reaching the airport.
Deportation flights from the US have attracted increased attention given Donald Trump's pledge to crack down on illegal immigration, which includes the use of military planes and shackles, conditions decried as inhumane by the Indian opposition.
To send them like this abruptly in a military aircraft and in handcuffs is an insult to India, it's an insult to the dignity of Indians, and we should certainly protest.
The government sought to reassure while conscious not to ruffle feathers in the White House.
We are, of course, engaging the US government to ensure that the returning deportees are not mistreated. At the same time, the House will appreciate that our focus should be on strong crackdown on the illegal migration industry.
The saga has cast a light on unauthorized Indians in the US. A Johns Hopkins University study out this week says the public and policymakers tend to overlook them because they're seen as bringing more skilled labor than other groups. And confusion in the data means we don't actually know whether their population has increased or not. The paper says the number of unauthorized Indian migrants arrested has surged, while official figures say their total population has shrunk. In any case, Indians still make up a small fraction of all the unauthorized migrants in the country, only 2% at the most recent count.
Now, Suhasini, this wasn't the first time the US had deported Indian migrants. In fact, more than 15,000 have been sent back since 2009. Why did it send such a shock this time, though?
Well, I think to begin with, the manner in which the Indian alleged illegal immigrants were sent back was a bit of a shock, and you saw some of the reactions in India, particularly in Parliament, for three reasons. One, because they were sent on board a military plane. This is the first time. You mentioned those previous years since 2009, but this is the first time a U.S. military plane has been used. And if you remember, the Colombian president, Venezuelan president, has called that really inhumane and said send them by regular charter flight because military planes tend to be cramped conditions. There are not enough facilities for all of those on board. And those were some of the stories we heard as the Indians came off. The second, which is again unprecedented, is the chief of Border Patrol in the United States actually put out a video on social media showing men in shackles. Now, this might play well in the domestic audience for the United States, showing how they're treating illegal immigrants. But for Indians, watching those visuals and having U.S. officials almost proudly boast about how they were packing off scores of Indians really was extremely offensive. Even the children apparently had ropes put around their feet. And there was an outcry over these reports in particular. After all that, the Ministry of External Affairs did kind of make a statement. They said they've registered concerns with the United States, but obviously in the preamble to Mr. Modi's visit to the US, they didn't want to get the pot boiling too much and express a protest or a démarche in that sense. But that's the reason why there was such an outcry in India.
Now, the report we watched earlier also talked about statistics being tricky because of what many of undocumented Indian migrants bring to the US economy. How has it been over the past decades?
So what we've seen is an increase in numbers. Now, where those numbers are is really the question. We know the government has told us in India that the US has now notified them of about 400 to 500 immigrants who have been identified for deportation. So in the next few weeks, you're probably likely to see more of these flights coming in. What manner they will be and how they will be publicized is another matter. The second really is the number of those who have been detained or charged with illegal immigration violations is about 24,000 according to the ICE's own website. And a Pew survey based on ICE figures has actually estimated that there are 725,000 undocumented Indian illegal or Indian migrants in the United States. So you're getting a sense of what those numbers are. India is there at number 3 or number 4 behind countries like Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador.
Suhasini Haidar, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. And that's it for this week's Access Asia, but please do stay tuned if you can. There's more news coming up on France 24.